What if I told you the ground beneath your feet is hiding 111 secrets so disturbing, the people who buried them prayed you'd never find out? From a Confederate submarine raised with all 8 crewmen still frozen at their stations, to 53 sacrificed young women laid in perfect rows beneath an Illinois mound, to a Pennsylvania town that's been burning underground since 1962. America is not the country you think it is. Every state, every city, every quiet backyard in America is sitting on top of something. Bones, bombs, buried ships, sealed asylums, plague pits paved over for parking lots. By the end of this video, you will never look at a construction site the same way again. Smash that subscribe button like you're swinging a shovel, because the deeper we dig, the darker it gets. Ready? Let's go down. 1. Manhattan was sitting on a secret graveyard the whole time. In 1991, some construction workers in Foley Square were digging a hole for a fancy federal office building. They probably expected dirt. Maybe a lost subway token. Instead, they hit bones, then more bones. Then over 400 coffins belonging to enslaved colonial New Yorkers, buried back when New York was still pretending it had nothing to do with slavery. The workers were horrified. The historians were stunned. The federal architects were sweating. Turns out, New York City had been built on top of an entire forgotten cemetery for centuries. 2. Philadelphia had a coffin lasagna underneath one of its busiest streets. In 2013, workers tearing into an old lot under Arch Street found coffins, then more coffins stacked underneath, and more under those. 5 layers deep of stacked colonial Philadelphians from the First Baptist burial ground who apparently got upgraded into a parking lot situation somewhere along the way. Archaeologists were baffled. City officials looked confused. Nearby pedestrians sipping coffee had no idea they had been walking over a bunk bed cemetery for 2 centuries. Philadelphia basically forgot it buried thousands of its own founders and then paved over them. 3. Jamestown colonists got so hungry in 1609 they straight up ate each other. Archaeologists in 2012 dug up a teenage girl's skull they nicknamed Jane. Her bones had knife marks, chop marks on the forehead, cuts on the jaw, the kind of marks you make when you are trying to get to the brain because you are starving and your fancy English manners have officially left the building. Historians had always whispered about cannibalism during the starving time, but Jane confirmed it. The colonists ate horses, then dogs, then rats, then shoes, then Jane. America's first permanent English colony had a real rough winter. 4. The Confederate submarine crew was found still sitting at their battle stations. The H.L. Hunley sank in 1864 after becoming the first sub to ever sink a warship. Then it just vanished. In 2000, they finally raised it out of the Charleston Harbor mud and cracked it open expecting chaos inside. Instead, all 8 crewmen were calmly seated at their posts. Hands near their cranks, no panic, no scramble for the hatch. Just 8 skeletons quietly seated like they were waiting for a bus. Scientists are still arguing about what killed them. The men themselves apparently never even noticed they were dying. 5. The last American slave ship was hiding in Alabama mud the whole time. The Clotilda illegally smuggled enslaved Africans into Mobile Bay in 1860, 50 years after the trade was banned. Then the captain burned it and sank it to hide the evidence. For over a century, descendants of the survivors in Africatown swore the wreck was out there. Historians shrugged. Then, in 2019, a reporter and a team of marine archaeologists actually found it sitting in the mud, right where the locals always said it was. The captain thought he got away with it. The mud kept the receipts. 6. Portland had trapdoors specifically designed to kidnap drunk sailors. The Shanghai tunnels under the city were a whole underground network where bar owners would press a button and the floor would literally drop open. The sailor would tumble down into a holding cell. Then he would get sold to a ship captain who needed crew. He would wake up the next morning in the middle of the ocean wondering what happened to Tuesday. This happened well into the 1900s. Tourists today walk through the tunnels and look at the deadfalls like cute relics. Thousands of guys got yeeted into the Pacific from those things. 7. Seattle has an entire city buried under itself. After the Great Fire of 1889, the city decided to rebuild one full story higher to fix some drainage problems. They just paved over the old downtown. Shops, sidewalks, storefronts, sealed up like a time capsule nobody opened. In 1965, someone finally cracked it back open and found the original Seattle still sitting down there with intact signs and counters and dusty old windows. Tourists now take underground tours past the bones of the old city. The shopkeepers from 1889 would be horrified to learn their store is now a basement. 8. A town in Pennsylvania has been on fire underground for over 60 years. In 1962, someone in Centralia lit some trash on fire in a pit. The trash fire crept down into an exposed coal seam. That coal seam connected to an enormous network of abandoned mines running under the entire town. The fire shrugged and said, "This is my house now." Sinkholes started opening. Toxic smoke poured out of basements. The ground itself got too hot to stand on. The government bought everybody out. Centralia is now a ghost town with steam hissing out of cracks in the road. 9. There is a Wild West town in California where the dishes are still on the tables. Body was a gold rush boomtown with about 10,000 residents in the 1880s. Then the gold ran out. People left so fast they did not even pack. Coffee cups on counters, bottles behind the bar, school books still open on desks. California eventually declared it a state park under a policy called arrested decay, which basically means do not touch anything ever. So Body just sits there frozen mid-sentence like the entire town stepped outside for a smoke in 1915 and forgot to come back. 10. There is an island next to New York City stacked with over 1 million unclaimed bodies. Hart Island has been the city's potter's field since the Civil War. If you die in New York and nobody claims you, you get a numbered pine box and a boat ride. Until recently, inmates from Rikers did the digging. The trenches hold babies, unidentified people, AIDS victims, COVID victims, all stacked neatly in numbered rows nobody talks about. Tourists ride past it on the ferry every day with no idea they are looking at one of America's largest cemeteries. 11. Imagine cracking open an ancient burial mound and finding 53 sacrificed young women, lined up in 2 neat rows. That is what happened at Cahokia in Illinois, a massive native city that was once larger than London. Archaeologists digging into Mound 72 in the 1960s uncovered the girls laid out side by side like some unsettling ceremony nobody had ever written down. They were all around the same age and all ritually killed at roughly the same moment. Historians still argue whether it was religious or political. Cahokia just buried them and quietly moved on with its day. 12. Oklahoma had its own ancient artistic treasure, and a group of guys with dynamite completely demolished it in a single year. The Spiro Mounds held engraved shell cups unlike anything else discovered in North America. Then, in 1935, a team of treasure hunters leased the land and started blowing the mounds apart for profit. They sold rare artifacts straight out of the back of pickup trucks and smashed whatever did not move fast enough. Archaeologists arrived later and basically had to mourn an entire lost art tradition. The surviving pieces sit in museums while the rest scattered across private collections. 13. Picture 2 cowboys searching for a lost cow and accidentally stumbling onto an ancient sealed city full of preserved mummies. That is the real Mesa Verde origin story from 1888. The cowboys were wandering through a Colorado canyon when they looked up and saw an enormous stone apartment complex tucked into the cliff face above them. They climbed inside and found rooms that had been sealed shut from within for centuries. Archaeologists later opened those rooms and discovered ancestral Puebloan remains preserved by the dry desert air. The cowboys never found their cow, but they found something significantly stranger. 14. Scientists eventually proved that the residents of Chaco Canyon had been eating each other by carefully analyzing their ancient poop. Pueblo Bonito was a fancy, astronomically aligned ceremonial center in New Mexico that scholars long treated like the Vatican of the Southwest. Then, in the year 2000, researchers got their hands on some coprolite, which is the polite scientific term for fossilized waste, and ran it through a laboratory. The samples contained traces of human muscle protein. The cannibalism rumors had circled archaeology departments for years, and this evidence finally sealed the case. Tour guides quietly updated their scripts after that. 15. A famously enlightened reform prison had been quietly running a secret torture dungeon underground for decades without anyone outside knowing. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia was supposed to represent the future of humane incarceration, with its solitary cells and quiet reflection. Then in 1995, renovation crews uncovered a buried block of punishment cells the staff used to call the Klondike. There was no light and no ventilation inside, just stone boxes where inmates were stuffed for days at a time. Al Capone served his sentence there, and somehow even he never mentioned the hidden basement to anyone. 16. Workers cleaning out an abandoned New York asylum attic in 1995 found 400 suitcases that had been waiting decades for their owners to come back. Willard Asylum was one of those grim, long-term institutions where patients checked in and almost never checked out again. The bags were stacked everywhere across the attic floor when the cleaning crew finally opened it up. Each suitcase belonged to one patient and still held wedding dresses, photographs, letters, and tools of trades they would never get to practice again. The asylum had kept the luggage perfectly safe but never returned a single bag. 17. Inside a Confederate prison camp, crossing an invisible painted line would get a prisoner instantly shot by a sharpshooter without any warning. Andersonville in Georgia held Union soldiers in an open stockade with no roof, no real sanitation, and almost no food. The Confederate guards drew a trench around the inner edge of the fence and named it the Deadline. Roughly 13,000 men died there from disease, starvation, and the simple act of trying to reach drinking water. Archaeologists excavated the actual trench in 1989 and confirmed the survivor accounts had not been exaggerating anything at all. 18. A group of Union coal miners decided to try winning the Civil War by drilling a massive bomb directly underneath the Confederate Army. At the Siege of Petersburg in 1864, Pennsylvania miners turned soldier dug a 500-foot tunnel under enemy lines and packed the end with 4 tons of gunpowder. The explosion carved a crater the size of a swimming pool and killed 300 Confederates instantly in a single moment. Then the Union troops charged straight into the crater and got trapped, while Confederates picked them off from the rim. Historians explored the hole again in the 70s. 19. When archaeologists finally raised a sunken Confederate ironclad in 2015, the cannons inside were somehow still loaded after a century and a half. The CSS Georgia was so heavy and so badly designed, it could barely move during the Civil War, so the Confederates parked it as a floating fortress in the Savannah River. When Sherman came marching through Georgia in 1864, they scuttled the entire vessel to keep it out of Union hands. It sat quietly in the river mud for 150 years. When the recovery team hauled it up, the guns were still primed. 20. Tourists in St. Augustine casually walk past Spanish shackles that have been bolted into the stone wall since 1672 without really thinking about it. Castillo de San Marcos is the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States, built from a weird local stone called coquina that absorbs cannonballs like sponge cake. Down inside the cells, the original iron Spanish shackles are still fixed exactly where the soldiers first installed them centuries ago. Visitors snap photos and children sometimes touch them. 3.5 centuries of American history have rolled past, while those shackles patiently wait for their next prisoner. 21. Picture archaeologists in 1994 confirming that New England's first English colony was actually in Maine, not Massachusetts, and basically rewriting a few textbooks in the process. The Popham colony was founded in 1607, the same year as Jamestown, but it lasted only about 14 months before everyone packed up and sailed home. Historians had argued about its exact location for centuries until the dig finally proved it. The colonists built a fort, a storehouse, and even the first English ship constructed in the Americas. Then one brutal Maine winter convinced every single one of them to immediately quit. 22. Scientists in 1997 actually dug up frozen bodies in Alaska to recover the living virus that killed 50 million people in 1918. The tiny village of Brevig Mission had lost almost its entire adult population to the flu pandemic in just 5 days. The victims were buried in permafrost, which acted like a giant natural freezer for 80 years. A researcher named Johann Hultin convinced the village elders to let him exhume the bodies and extract lung tissue from one woman. That tissue still contained viable flu virus. Scientists then sequenced its genome to figure out why it had killed so efficiently. 23. Kids in suburban St. Louis were apparently playing in literal Manhattan Project radioactive waste for decades without anyone telling their parents. Coldwater Creek runs right through neighborhoods near the old nuclear weapons production sites from the 1940s. The leftover radioactive material got dumped nearby, leached into the creek, and quietly contaminated the playgrounds and backyards downstream for generations. Residents started noticing unusually high cancer rates among childhood friends and finally got the contamination officially documented in 2013. The federal government basically responded with a long, uncomfortable silence. People who grew up there are still demanding answers about what exactly poisoned their childhood neighborhoods. 24. A single dropped wrench socket nearly turned Arkansas into a glowing crater in 1980. An Air Force technician was performing routine maintenance inside a Titan II missile silo near Damascus when he dropped a tool that fell 70 feet and punctured the fuel tank. The missile started leaking, and the technicians evacuated while everyone outside basically held their breath for hours. Eventually, the whole silo exploded, launching the nuclear warhead clean out of the ground and into a nearby field. The warhead miraculously did not detonate, but one airman was killed and 21 others were injured. Arkansas came genuinely close to vanishing that night. 25. A live Japanese balloon bomb from World War II was casually discovered sitting in the woods near the Oregon border in 2014. During the war, Japan launched thousands of paper balloons rigged with explosives and floated them across the Pacific on the jet stream, hoping they would land in America and cause chaos. Most landed harmlessly, but one killed a pregnant woman and 5 children in Oregon in 1945. Loggers found the 2014 relic still armed and dangerous. A bomb squad detonated it on the spot. 70 years after the war ended, Japan technically still has weapons quietly aging in American forests. 26. The deadliest maritime disaster in American history happened on a river, and the wreck was eventually located in a soybean field. The Sultana was a steamboat overloaded with Union prisoners of war heading home in 1865 when its boilers exploded and killed roughly 1,800 people. That is more deaths than the Titanic, and almost nobody remembers it because Lincoln had been assassinated 2 weeks earlier. The Mississippi River shifted course over the next century, and the wreck slowly ended up buried under an Arkansas farm. Treasure hunters located the remains in 1982 using metal detectors in someone's bean field. 27. Renovation crews tearing into an old NYU building in 2003 accidentally recovered the original locked stairwell door from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster. In 1911, 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, died in that factory fire because the bosses had locked the exits to prevent unauthorized breaks. The locked door was the central piece of evidence, and it had been quietly preserved inside the building's structure for almost a century. Workers found it during demolition, and historians basically gasped. That single door changed labor laws across America and almost ended up in a dumpster. 28. Chicago casually flooded itself in 1992 because everyone had completely forgotten about a 60-mile freight tunnel network buried under the entire downtown. The tunnels were built in 1899 to move cargo and coal under the streets, but they got abandoned and basically erased from public memory by the 1950s. Then a construction crew, driving pilings near the Chicago River, accidentally punctured a tunnel wall. River water poured in and flooded basements across the entire loop. The damage hit nearly $2 billion. The city had been sitting on a forgotten plumbing time bomb for almost 40 years. 29. A Detroit warehouse cracked open in 1972, and inside sat fully loaded Prohibition-era bootleg trucks that had been parked there since the 1920s. The building had a hidden tunnel connecting it directly to the Detroit River, which was the unofficial highway for Canadian whiskey smuggled across during Prohibition. The bootleggers had apparently abandoned the operation in a hurry, locked the doors, and never came back to grab their inventory. The trucks were still loaded with crates of whiskey when investigators finally entered. Detroit ran roughly 75% of all illegal alcohol entering the United States, and one warehouse perfectly froze the evidence. 30. Historians spent over a century arguing about exactly where the Sand Creek Massacre actually happened, until ground-penetrating radar finally settled it in 1999. In 1864, Colorado militia attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village at dawn and killed roughly 230 people, mostly women and children. The army deliberately obscured the location afterward because the massacre was an embarrassment, even by frontier standards. Tribal descendants always insisted they knew the real site, but skeptics doubted them for generations. The radar survey found bullets, cannonball fragments, and personal items exactly where tribal oral history had always placed the killings. 41. A frontier steamboat loaded with 200 tons of 19th-century cargo was excavated from a Kansas cornfield in 1988. The Arabia sank in 1856 after hitting a submerged tree snag in the Missouri River, and the river later shifted course, leaving the wreck buried under a farm. A local family of refrigeration repairmen spent years studying old maps before locating the boat 45 feet underground. They dug it up themselves and found everything perfectly preserved in the cold mud. Boots, dishes, jars of pickles still edible, even a bottle of champagne. The cargo basically froze an entire frontier general store in time. 42. The actual escape tunnel that 3 inmates used to break out of Alcatraz in 1962 was preserved exactly as they left it. The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris spent months patiently widening the air vents in their cells using sharpened spoons, a stolen drill motor, and pure determination. They left papier-mâché dummy heads in their beds, slipped through the tunnel, and floated away on a raft made of stitched-together raincoats. Nobody has ever proven what happened to them after that night. The FBI officially closed the case in 1979. The tunnel is still right there waiting on Alcatraz. 43. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2018 revealed mass graves from the 1900 Galveston hurricane hidden underneath modern parking lots. The storm killed somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people in a single night, making it still the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The survivors had to dispose of bodies so quickly they tried burying them at sea, but the corpses kept washing back ashore. So they switched to burning pyres on the beach and digging hasty pits inland. Galveston eventually rebuilt right on top of those pits. Drivers today park their cars on hurricane victims without ever knowing. 44. The Jamestown flood of 1889 killed over 2,000 people in Pennsylvania, and Victorian household goods buried in that mud were re-excavated almost a century later. A wealthy hunting club's poorly maintained dam burst above the town and sent 20 million tons of water roaring through Johnstown in 10 minutes. Entire families and homes got pulverized against a stone bridge downstream. The mud preserved sewing machines, china sets, family photos, and toys exactly where they landed. Archaeologists in the 1980s carefully extracted them. The disaster also basically invented modern American disaster relief because Clara Barton showed up with the brand new Red Cross. 45. The deadliest wildfire in American history happened the same exact night as the famous Chicago fire, and almost no one in the country has ever heard of it. The Peshtigo Fire of 1871 ripped through Wisconsin and killed an estimated 1,500 to 2,500 people in one apocalyptic evening. Whole towns were vaporized. Survivors described tornadoes of flame and rivers boiling. The Chicago story dominated newspapers because it had photographers and reporters, while Peshtigo sat in a remote logging region nobody bothered to cover. Cadaver dogs in 2002 finally located mass graves the original survivors had hastily dug. 46. A whole village of Native American earth lodges in North Dakota preserved family belongings from the moment a smallpox epidemic basically wiped out the Mandan people in 1837. The disease arrived on a steamboat and killed roughly 90% of the population in a matter of weeks. Families died inside their homes faster than anyone could conduct funerals. The earth lodges at Knife River collapsed over time with everything still inside. Archaeologists later carefully excavated tools, beads, pots, and toys, all sitting exactly where their owners had left them. The Mandan people survived as a culture but never recovered their original population. 47. Archaeologists spent the 2010s systematically mapping forgotten burial sites along the Trail of Tears across multiple southern states. The forced removal of around 60,000 Native Americans in the 1830s killed thousands during the march itself, and many of those graves were never properly recorded. The federal government essentially wanted the trail to disappear from memory. Modern researchers used historical journals, oral histories, and ground radar to identify dozens of resting places. Some sit beneath highways and shopping centers today. The mapping work returned identities and dignity to people whose deaths the United States had specifically engineered and then deliberately tried to forget. 48. Buried personal items and toys from the Topaz Japanese-American internment camp in Utah were carefully recovered by archaeologists in 2017. During World War II, the United States government rounded up roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent and shipped them to remote camps in the desert. Families had been given only a few days to pack before reporting for relocation. When the camps closed at the end of the war, internees often buried items they could not carry. Researchers found tea sets, marbles, dolls, and personal mementos. Each object basically tells a small story of an interrupted American life. 49. The Aleut people of Alaska were forcibly relocated by the United States government during World War II, and many of them died forgotten in internment camps. After Japan attacked the Aleutian Islands in 1942, the military evacuated nearly 900 Aleut residents to abandoned canneries in southeast Alaska, with no heat, no sanitation, and no medical care. Roughly 1 in 10 died from disease, mostly tuberculosis and measles. Their graves at places like Funter Bay sat unmarked and forgotten for decades. The federal government finally issued a formal apology in 1988. Most Americans still have absolutely no idea any of this ever happened. 50. Investigators in the 1990s exhumed the bodies of men who had been deliberately allowed to die of syphilis as part of a 40-year government experiment. The Tuskegee study followed roughly 600 black sharecroppers in Alabama starting in 1932 and intentionally withheld penicillin treatment even after the cure became widely available. The men thought they were getting free health care. They were actually getting watched. The study only ended in 1972 after a whistleblower leaked it to the press. Forensic teams later exhumed several victims to document what the disease had done to their untreated bodies. 51. The woman whose stolen cells essentially built modern medicine did not have a marked grave until 2010. Henrietta Lacks was a black tobacco farmer from Virginia who died of cervical cancer in 1951 at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Doctors took a sample of her tumor without her permission and discovered her cells could survive and replicate indefinitely in a lab. Those HeLa cells became the foundation for the polio vaccine, cancer research, and countless drugs. Her family received nothing for decades and did not even know about it. She was buried in an unmarked plot until her descendants and a researcher finally placed a headstone. 52. 3 civil rights workers murdered in Mississippi in 1964 were found buried inside an earthen dam after a 44-day FBI search. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had been registering black voters during Freedom Summer when local Klansmen, including a sheriff's deputy, abducted and shot them. The killers buried the bodies under tons of red clay using bulldozers. The FBI only found them after paying an informant a substantial bribe for the location. The case inspired the film Mississippi Burning. The state of Mississippi did not actually convict the ringleader of the murders until 2005. 53. Ground-penetrating radar in 2020 finally located mass graves from the Tulsa Race Massacre that survivors had been describing for an entire century. In 1921, a white mob attacked the prosperous black neighborhood of Greenwood, also called Black Wall Street, and burned 35 blocks to the ground. Estimates suggest up to 300 black residents died, though the city quietly refused to investigate for generations. The radar survey of Oaklawn Cemetery revealed 19 coffins exactly where black survivors had insisted bodies were dumped. Forensic teams have since carefully exhumed remains, hoping DNA can finally identify some of the victims. 54. Bone fragments from children killed during the 1985 MOVE bombing somehow ended up sitting in a storage box at the University of Pennsylvania Museum for decades. Philadelphia police dropped a bomb from a helicopter onto a black liberation group's row house in West Philadelphia. killing 11 people including 5 children and destroying 61 homes in the fire. Researchers later borrowed remains for analysis and apparently just never returned them. The remains sat in a museum drawer until a journalist exposed the situation in 2021. Penn issued a formal apology, and Philadelphia had to confront another piece of its history. 55. The Ludlow Massacre death pit where 11 children and 2 women suffocated in 1914 was excavated by archaeologists in 1998. Coal miners in Colorado had gone on strike against the Rockefeller-owned company, and the Colorado National Guard attacked their tent colony with machine guns and fire. Families had dug cellars beneath their tents to hide from gunfire, but the tents above them caught fire and smoke filled the underground spaces. The victims trapped below never made it out. The dig revealed personal items including a child's doll. The massacre helped permanently change American labor laws and worker protections forever. 56. The graves of young women poisoned by glowing radium watch dial paint a century ago still set off radiation detectors today. The radium girls worked in factories in New Jersey and elsewhere during the 19-teens and 20s painting watch faces by hand. Their bosses told them to lick their brushes to keep fine points. The radium accumulated in their bones and slowly destroyed their jaws, hips, and spines. Several brave workers sued and basically created modern occupational safety law. Their bodies remained radioactive enough that scientists examining graves in the 20th century could measure the contamination through soil decades after death. 57. A sprawling Washington state facility that produced plutonium for atomic bombs is still quietly holding contaminated equipment buried in its soil since 1944. The Hanford site was a top-secret Manhattan Project location, and its scientists basically made up nuclear waste disposal as they went along. They poured liquid radioactive waste directly into the ground, buried contaminated tools in trenches, and even dumped material into open pits. The Columbia River runs right past the entire complex. Cleanup costs now exceed $100 billion and counting. Hanford holds the largest volume of radioactive waste in the entire Western Hemisphere by a wide margin. 58. A neighborhood in upstate New York was built directly on top of 21,000 tons of toxic chemical waste, and erosion eventually exposed the whole thing in 1978. Love Canal had originally been an abandoned canal that a chemical company filled with industrial waste in the 1940s, then sold to the local school board for $1. The board built an elementary school and houses on top. Residents started noticing strange smells, sick children, and chemical leaks in their basements. The federal government eventually evacuated the neighborhood and created the Superfund program, specifically because of what happened at Love Canal. 59. An entire Oklahoma mining town sat on top of poisonous chat piles, so massive the federal government basically bought everybody out and abandoned the whole place. Peacher was once one of the most productive lead and zinc mining towns in America, supplying critical metals for both world wars. The decades of mining left enormous gray piles of toxic waste called chat scattered everywhere, and children played on them like sand dunes. Blood lead levels in local kids reached terrifying numbers. The EPA started buying out residents in 2009. Peacher is now officially deserted, with its toxic hills still slowly poisoning the wind. 60. A small boy found dead in a cardboard box in Philadelphia in 1957 remained completely unidentified for 65 years. The case haunted detectives for generations. Someone had wrapped the malnourished 4-year-old in a blanket and dumped him in a wooded lot off Susquehanna Road. Investigators kept his face on a billboard for decades, hoping someone would recognize him. Advances in genetic genealogy finally cracked the case in 2022. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Detectives now believe they know who killed him, though they have not publicly named the suspect yet. Philadelphia finally got to bury him properly. 61. When a Georgia drought dropped lake levels in 2007, the gravestones of an entire flooded black town suddenly reappeared above the waterline. Lake Lanier had been created in the 1950s when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the Chattahoochee River and submerged the town of Oscarville. The town had originally been home to a thriving black community that white mobs had violently driven out back in 1912. The state then conveniently chose that exact area to flood decades later. Cemeteries and house foundations rose out of the receding water like a returning accusation. Locals still tell ghost stories about the lake today. 62. The first legally free black settlement in what would become the United States was located by ground-penetrating radar in 1986. Fort Mose was established in Florida in 1738 by escaped slaves from English colonies who reached Spanish territory. The Spanish governor offered them freedom in exchange for converting to Catholicism and helping defend St. Augustine. The fort had about 100 residents who served as a military garrison protecting the colony's northern approach. It was abandoned and basically forgotten when Florida changed hands. Archaeologists finally pinpointed its location, and the site is now an official Florida state park. 63. A mysterious earthwork city in Louisiana traded for red jasper owl pendants with tribes living over 1,000 miles away in 1700 BC. Poverty Point was a massive Native American site built by hunter-gatherers who somehow organized themselves into one of the most ambitious construction projects in ancient North America. The concentric earthen ridges and mounds required moving roughly 53 million cubic feet of soil entirely by hand. Archaeologists were stunned to find tiny owl-shaped pendants made from stone sourced in the Great Lakes region. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to build cities or run long-distance trade networks. 64. A swampy archaeological site in Florida preserved wooden ritual masks belonging to a vanished civilization that the Spanish basically annihilated. The Calusa people were a powerful nation that controlled southwest Florida using oysters and political muscle instead of agriculture. They built enormous shell mounds, some still towering over the landscape today, and ran a complex trade empire from canoes. Archaeologists in 1896 recovered carved wooden masks and ceremonial objects perfectly preserved in the muck. European diseases and colonial violence wiped out the Calusa within 2 centuries of contact. Their masks now sit in museums, staring out at a world the Calusa never made. 65. The original wooden timbers from the mill where gold was first discovered in California were excavated almost a century after the discovery. James Marshall spotted shiny flakes in the tail race of Sutter's Mill in January 1848, and that moment basically launched the entire gold rush. Within 2 years, roughly 300,000 people poured into California from around the world. The mill itself fell apart, got buried, and was lost to memory until archaeologists located the original tailrace timbers in 1947. The timbers were carefully preserved. Marshall himself died broke and bitter, never having gotten rich from the gold rush he ignited. 66. A Stanford-led archaeology project in 2014 recovered thousands of artifacts from the camps of Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad through Donner Pass. Around 20,000 Chinese workers carved the most dangerous stretch of the railroad through the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s, including blasting tunnels by hand through solid granite. Their camps were technically near the tracks, and the workers themselves had basically been erased from official history. The dig recovered teacups, opium pipes, gambling tokens, and tools that workers brought from their homeland. Each object essentially tells a small story of immigrant lives Americans had decided to forget. 67. When a sculptor was restoring an Empire State Building observation deck in 2002, he found fragments of the B-25 bomber that crashed into the building in 1945. A military pilot got lost in heavy fog and accidentally flew directly into the 79th floor at over 200 miles per hour. 14 people died, but the building itself basically just shook off the impact and reopened within days. The pieces of the airplane had been quietly embedded in the structure for over half a century. One engine had actually fallen through an elevator shaft. Restoration workers found chunks of the plane during renovation. 68. Archaeologists surveying Acoma Pueblo, Sasson, in 2002 uncovered a charred layer of timbers proving a brutal Spanish massacre that Pueblo oral history had described for centuries. In 1599, Spanish conquistador Juan de Onate sent troops to punish Acoma after villagers killed his nephew. The soldiers stormed the cliffside pueblo and killed roughly 800 residents. The Spanish then sentenced every surviving man over 25 to have one foot cut off. Acoma never forgot what happened that day. The dig confirmed the burn layer and timeline exactly as the Pueblo people had been describing the attack for over 400 years. 69. Imagine the Comanche getting so offended at a Spanish mission they brought 2,000 warriors to burn it to the ground. The San Saba mission in Texas had been established in 1757 to convert the Lipan Apache people, who happened to be longtime enemies of the Comanche. The Comanche took this as a serious political insult and showed up the following year. They killed 8 Spanish residents, including 2 priests, and torched everything. The Spanish later sent a revenge expedition that got humiliatingly defeated. Archaeologists finally relocated the lost mission site in 1993 after centuries of it sitting forgotten. 70. The first French settlement in what would become the United States was finally located in Florida in 2014, more than 450 years after Spanish soldiers massacred the colonists. Fort Caroline was established in 1564 by French Huguenots seeking religious freedom from Catholic France. The Spanish considered this a serious threat to their territorial claims. In 1565, Spanish forces under Pedro Menendez attacked the fort, killed nearly everyone, and hanged the survivors from trees with signs reading, "Not because they were French, but because they were heretics." The National Park Service finally confirmed the exact site. 71. In 2004, researchers verified the existence of actual hidden chambers underneath an Ohio farmhouse that had once been part of the Underground Railroad. The secret compartments inside the old home had been whispered about in local history circles for generations. Enslaved people fleeing north would hide inside the cramped spaces sometimes for days, while bounty hunters searched the property above them. The chambers connected to tunnels leading towards safer ground further north. The family who originally owned the house had risked their lives by sheltering escapees. Their secret architecture had been quietly waiting in the dirt to be officially confirmed. 72. Forensic analysis in 1985 identified the exact cabin hearth where Donner Party survivors had burned human bone to stay alive through a brutal Sierra Nevada winter. The Murphy cabin had sheltered some of the most desperate members of the trapped emigrant group during the 1846 disaster. Researchers examining the fire pit found bone fragments mixed with ash, and laboratory testing confirmed several pieces were human in origin. The cabin's occupants had clearly been forced into impossible choices as the snow buried them alive for months. Survivors later refused to discuss exactly what happened inside that desperate little structure. 73. Investigators discovered in the 1990s that an Iowa park superintendent had been stealing remains from the very native burial mounds he was supposed to be protecting. The effigy mounds preserve sacred earthworks shaped like bears, birds, and other animals built by indigenous people over 1,000 years ago. The superintendent had quietly removed human remains from the protected site and stored them in his garage for decades. Those remains were supposed to be ancestors that the native nations could eventually rebury under federal law. The case shocked the archaeological world and led to a long process of returning the stolen remains to descendant communities. 74. Evidence inside an Alabama cave proves humans had been continuously living in the exact same spot since around 7000 BC. Russell Cave preserved an unbroken record of indigenous occupation across roughly 9,000 years of changing climates, tools, and cultures. Archaeologists carefully excavated through the layered floor and read it like a book, starting at the surface and ending in the Stone Age. Each layer held arrowheads, tools, food remains, and traces of ancient hearths. People had lived inside that single cave longer than every civilization in recorded history combined. The cave is now a national monument under the National Park Service. 75. Artifacts inside a Pennsylvania rock shelter may date back 16,000 years, which would basically rewrite the entire history of human migration into the Americas. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter has produced controversially old carbon dates ever since serious excavation began there in the 1970s. Mainstream archaeology had long insisted that humans only reached North America around 13,000 years ago. The Meadowcroft dates pushed that timeline back significantly and started a still ongoing scientific argument among researchers. Some scholars question possible carbon contamination at the site. Others accept the dates and rework their textbooks. Either way, American prehistory turned out older than anyone thought. 76. Two college students walking along the Columbia River in 1996 accidentally discovered a 9,000-year-old skeleton sticking out of the bank. They initially thought it was a recent murder victim and called the police to report it. Forensic examination quickly revealed Kennewick Man was actually one of the oldest and most complete ancient human skeletons ever found in North America. His skull features confused researchers because they did not match expected ancestral patterns at all. A bitter legal battle erupted between scientists who wanted to study him and native tribes who wanted to bury him. The tribes eventually won. 77. Inside a Florida bog, peat chemistry preserved 168 ancient human brains intact for roughly 7,000 years. Construction workers digging a pond at Windover near Titusville hit human bones in 1984 and immediately stopped their work. Archaeologists arrived and realized they were looking at one of the most extraordinary burial sites ever discovered anywhere in the Americas. The chemistry of the bog had preserved soft tissue, including brain matter, that scientists could actually extract DNA from. The bodies had been carefully wrapped in fabric and weighted down before burial. The discovery completely changed scientific understanding of early American populations. 78. A cowboy named George McJunkin spotted enormous bones sticking out of an arroyo near Folsom, New Mexico in 1908, and his accidental discovery basically rewrote the entire timeline of humans in North America. The bones belonged to a species of bison that had gone extinct at the end of the last ice age, which was already interesting enough. Years later, archaeologists arrived and found human-made spear points embedded directly between the bison's ribs. The evidence was completely undeniable. Humans had been hunting Ice Age animals thousands of years earlier than the scientific establishment had ever been willing to admit. 79. The National Park Service carefully mapped the actual escape tunnel and trapdoor that John Wilkes Booth used after shooting Lincoln, finally documenting the route in 1968. Ford's Theater had been preserved as a historic site, but the precise architecture of Booth's escape had been forgotten over the decades. After firing the shot from the presidential box, Booth jumped onto the stage, broke his leg, and limped out through a backstage corridor. He then disappeared into the Washington streets and led federal agents on a 12-day manhunt. The mapping project documented exactly which doors and hallways the assassin had used. 80. A train supposedly carrying the last of the Confederate treasury gold vanished near Danville, Virginia in 1865, and a portion of it was apparently recovered in 1972. The official story claims most of the gold went toward paying remaining Confederate soldiers as the government collapsed around them. Persistent rumors insisted that significant quantities had been buried, stolen, or hidden during the chaos of the final retreat south. Treasure hunters spent over a century searching the route between Richmond and the final hiding spots. A private discovery in 1972 near the suspected hiding area finally yielded gold coins after generations of failed attempts. 81. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Valley Forge in 1962 revealed that the soldier huts where Washington's Continental Army nearly froze to death still left buried debris in the soil. The famous winter encampment of 1777 and 78 saw roughly 2,000 men die from disease, malnutrition, and cold, while the British comfortably occupied Philadelphia just a few miles away. The huts the soldiers built themselves had been simple log structures with dirt floors. Each one disappeared back into the landscape long ago. Archaeologists found buttons, musket balls, and personal items exactly where the freezing soldiers had carved out their miserable shelters. 82. Excavation of the Yorktown battlefield. In 1976, uncovered French sapper tools sitting exactly where they had been dropped during the final siege of the Revolutionary War. The 1781 battle ended with British General Cornwallis surrendering to George Washington and basically guaranteeing American independence. French troops had played a critical role digging the trenches that brought American and French cannons close enough to pound the British position into submission. The tools had been left behind during the chaos of the surrender. The bicentennial dig recovered them perfectly preserved underground. France essentially handed America its independence and then politely went home. 83. a British warship that sank off the Delaware coast in 1798, was raised in 1986 with the remains of its crew still inside. The HMS de Brock had been hauling captured Spanish treasure when an unexpected squall flipped it over and sent everyone straight to the bottom. The wreck became one of the most legendary treasure rumors on the East Coast for nearly 2 centuries. Salvagers finally lifted the entire hull only to discover the gold and silver myth had been wildly exaggerated. The crew remains, however, were genuinely there. Delaware now preserves the recovered artifacts in a state museum dedicated to the doomed ship. 84. The original base of the flagpole that flew the Star-Spangled Banner over Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 was unearthed in 1958. Francis Scott Key had watched that exact flag survive a brutal British naval bombardment in 1814 and got so inspired he scribbled a poem on the back of a letter. That poem eventually became the national anthem. The flag itself now lives at the Smithsonian. The flagpole base, however, had been forgotten and buried for over a century until restoration crews working on the fort uncovered the original foundation. The pole's location is now marked. 85. The original mission burial pit underneath the Alamo was identified during cathedral surveys in 1936, and historians had basically been walking over it for 100 years. Before the famous 1836 battle, the Alamo had been a Spanish mission where indigenous converts were baptized, lived, and buried. The chapel still standing today sits on top of layered Spanish colonial graves. The defenders who died fighting Santa Anna in the famous battle were burned and their ashes scattered. The earlier mission residents remained buried right where they had been laid centuries before. Tourists visit the Alamo without realizing how layered the ground actually is. 86. The bell recovered from the sunken USS Maine after the 1898 explosion that helped start the Spanish-American War was installed at Arlington National Cemetery in 1915. The battleship had blown up mysteriously in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. Newspaper publishers like William Randolph Hearst used the disaster to scream for war with Spain, using the famous slogan, "Remember the Maine." Investigations later suggested the explosion was probably accidental rather than a Spanish attack. The bell now sits at the Maine Memorial in Arlington, ringing for a war that may have started over a kitchen fire. 87. The famous Edmund Fitzgerald freighter that sank in Lake Superior in 1975 still holds all 29 crew members sealed inside the wreckage. The massive ore carrier vanished during a brutal November storm with no distress call, no survivors, and no clear explanation for what happened. Gordon Lightfoot turned the disaster into one of the most famous folk songs in American history. The wreck sits in 530 feet of cold, dark water. Submersible expeditions have documented the ship, but Canadian and American authorities formally agreed to leave the crew undisturbed inside the hull as a permanent grave. 88. Debris from the Apollo 1 launch pad fire that killed 3 American astronauts in 1967 was sealed inside an abandoned Cape Canaveral silo until 2016. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee had been running a routine test inside the spacecraft when a spark ignited the pure oxygen environment. The capsule went up in seconds and the crew never got out. NASA quietly stored the burned wreckage out of sight for nearly 50 years. The agency finally opened a public memorial exhibit at the Kennedy Space Center using pieces of the actual command module hatch that had trapped the astronauts inside. 89. The wooden launch rail that the Wright brothers used to send their first airplane into the air. In 1903 was recovered from drifting dune sand in 1928. Wilbur and Orville had built a simple 60-foot wooden track at Kitty Hawk to give the flyer a controlled run before takeoff. The historic 12-second flight changed everything about how humans moved across the planet. The rail itself, however, had been quietly buried by shifting Outer Banks sand for a quarter century. Crews looking to mark the anniversary of the flight found and recovered the original wooden track exactly where the brothers had left it. 90. Buried equipment from the 17-mile transatlantic telegraph cable terminus at Hearts Content, Newfoundland, was located in 1992 after decades of being forgotten. The 1858 cable had been the first attempt to connect Europe and North America by telegraph, and the technology basically shrank the planet overnight. Messages that once took weeks by ship could suddenly cross the Atlantic in minutes. The original cable failed after a few weeks. A working version was finally laid in 1866. The original terminus station equipment sat quietly in the ground until historians searching for the exact landing site finally pinpointed it. 91. Researchers in 1982 confirmed that an ancient Native American earthwork in Newark, Ohio, had been precisely aligned with the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. The Hopewell people built the massive ceremonial complex around 2,000 years ago using geometry that would have impressed any modern engineer. Octagons connected to perfect circles across hundreds of acres. The lunar alignment was so accurate that researchers basically had to admit prehistoric people had been doing serious astronomy in the American Midwest. Part of the site is now a country club, meaning golfers regularly tee off across one of the most sophisticated ancient observatories in North America. 92. Excavators in 1937 dug into a Montana cave and uncovered ancient paintings sealed underneath layers of sediment for roughly 2,000 years. The Pictograph Cave near Billings held images painted by indigenous people stretching back generations, including figures of warriors, animals, and ceremonial symbols. Wind and dust had slowly buried the lower portions of the cave wall, basically sealing the older artwork like a time capsule. Archaeologists carefully excavated down through the layers and revealed the hidden paintings. The cave is now a Montana state park, where visitors can see artwork that had been quietly waiting underground for someone to come looking for it. 93. A construction worker in 1968 accidentally uncovered the only known burial of a Clovis-era child anywhere in the Americas while operating a front-end loader in Montana. The Anzac site contained the remains of a toddler buried roughly 12,600 years ago, along with over 100 ceremonial stone tools coated in red ochre. The child became the oldest individual ever fully sequenced from ancient American DNA. Researchers eventually returned the remains to native tribes for reburial in 2014. The discovery basically confirmed that the Clovis people were directly ancestral to most modern indigenous populations across both American continents. 94. A 10,600-year-old mummy from a Nevada cave was finally confirmed in 1996 as the oldest preserved human ever found in North America. Spirit Caveman had originally been excavated way back in 1940 but was casually shelved in a museum drawer because nobody realized his actual age. Modern radiocarbon dating eventually revealed researchers had been ignoring one of the most important ancient skeletons on the continent for over half a century. The Northern Paiute tribe spent decades fighting for repatriation. The remains were finally returned and reburied in 2016 after one of the longest cultural battles in American archaeology. 95. Underwater archaeologists working a Florida river bottom in 2016 recovered mastodon butchering tools that pushed human presence in the southeast back to 14,500 years ago. The Page Ladson site sits at the bottom of the Osceola River, where divers spent years carefully excavating sediment by hand. They recovered a stone knife and a mastodon tusk with cut marks, proving humans had butchered the animal there. The dates blew up the standard Clovis first timeline of human migration. People had clearly been hunting Ice Age megafauna in Florida thousands of years before the supposed first wave of American settlers ever arrived. 96. An inscribed stone, allegedly recovered from a West Virginia burial mound in 1838, is still being argued about by historians almost 200 years later. The Grave Creek Mound is one of the largest conical earthworks built by ancient Adena people in the eastern United States. Workers excavating the mound supposedly found a small stone carved with mysterious characters that some claimed resembled ancient Mediterranean scripts. Skeptics have called the inscription an obvious hoax for generations. Believers have insisted it proves transatlantic contact thousands of years before Columbus. The stone itself sits in a museum, refusing to settle the argument either way. 97. When workers were digging the original New York City subway tunnel in 1904, they unexpectedly uncovered colonial Dutch foundations buried deep beneath Manhattan. The Interborough Rapid Transit Company had been blasting through bedrock to lay the first underground line when crews started hitting wooden beams, brick walls, and old stone footings. New Amsterdam had been the original Dutch settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan before the English took over in 1664. Layers of forgotten city had basically been paved over for centuries. The subway diggers found pieces of the original colonial waterfront, sitting quietly under modern streets. 98. Researchers analyzing the recovered torpedo spar of the H.L. Hunley submarine finally figured out in 2017 why all 8 crew members had died at their stations after sinking the USS Housatonic. The Confederate submarine had attacked the Union warship by ramming a copper torpedo into its hull and pulling away to a supposedly safe distance. The new analysis showed the explosion actually went off basically point blank. The shock wave traveling through the water would have killed every crewman instantly without leaving a single external mark on their bodies. The mystery of the perfectly seated skeletons finally had a clear physical explanation. 99. A Plymouth-era ossuary in Massachusetts containing roughly 1,200 bones was discovered and reinterred all the way back in 1809. Workers expanding a graveyard at Old Bedford Village uncovered an enormous collection of human remains that had clearly been stacked together long before the dig. Researchers eventually realized the bones belonged to early colonial settlers whose original burial ground had been disturbed and then collectively reburied generations earlier. The bones had basically traveled through history together. Authorities at the time reburied them again with a proper marker. The site still holds the remains of some of the earliest English colonists in New England. 100. A prison ship cemetery hidden along the Brooklyn shore was suddenly exposed by erosion in 1808, revealing the buried remains of roughly 11,500 American prisoners of war. The British had used rotting hulks anchored in Wallabout Bay during the Revolutionary War to hold captured patriots in horrifying conditions. More Americans died on those floating prisons than in all the battles of the war combined. Bodies were thrown overboard or buried in shallow shore pits. Storms and tides slowly washed the remains back into view decades later. The Prison Ship Martyrs Monument now stands in Brooklyn to honor the forgotten dead. 101. Reservation surveys conducted in 2010 finally identified the grave of a Crow scout who had been with Custer's command at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Crow Nation had supplied several scouts to the 7th Cavalry leading up to the 1876 disaster, because the Lakota and Cheyenne were their traditional enemies. The scouts had warned Custer that he was hopelessly outnumbered, and he basically ignored every single one of them. Several survived the battle by riding away when ordered. One scout was buried back on the Crow Reservation, his grave forgotten by everyone outside his family until modern researchers finally identified the location. 102. A Spanish treasure galleon that sank off the Florida Keys in 1622 was finally located in 1985 with roughly $400 million in gold, silver, and emeralds still aboard. The Nuestra Señora de Atocha had been hauling treasure from South America back to Spain when a hurricane sent it straight to the bottom of the Caribbean. Treasure hunter Mel Fisher spent 16 years searching for the wreck. His own son and daughter-in-law died during the hunt before the main pile was finally discovered. Fisher's family is still recovering artifacts from the site decades after his celebrated breakthrough. 103. The original wooden stake markers from the 1893 Cherokee Strip land rush were recovered during Oklahoma surveys in 2008. Roughly 100,000 settlers had lined up along the border of the Cherokee Outlet and basically sprinted into the territory to claim free farmland on a single afternoon. People drove wagons, rode horses, and even ran on foot to plant their stakes. The original wooden markers had been pounded into the dirt by exhausted families desperate for a piece of land. Most rotted away long ago. The surveyed remnants confirmed exactly where some of the original claims had been violently established. 104. The skull of Lewis Powell, who had been hanged in 1865 for his role in the Lincoln assassination conspiracy, was found sitting in a Smithsonian drawer in 1991. Powell had been part of the team that plotted to kill Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward on the same night. He stabbed Seward repeatedly, but failed to finish the job. After his execution, his remains had basically been scattered across various institutions over the following century. A researcher cataloging Smithsonian collections stumbled onto the skull. Powell's remains were finally reunited and reburied next to his mother in Florida. 105. Workers digging the Boston subway in 1908 accidentally exposed the foundation of a 1690 plague house that the city had built to quarantine smallpox victims. Colonial Boston had suffered repeated devastating epidemics throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The plague house had been a grim facility where sick residents were sent to either recover or die away from their families. The structure had been demolished long before the city expanded over the area. Subway crews uncovered the brick foundation almost 2 centuries later. Boston had basically built its modern transit system directly over the bones of its colonial public health nightmare. 106. Ground-penetrating radar in 2017 finally identified the post holes from the original Plymouth Meeting House on Burial Hill. The Pilgrims had built the simple wooden structure in 1621 as both a church and a defensive fortification overlooking the new settlement. It had served as the heart of the colony for decades before being replaced by larger buildings. The original location had been lost to memory for centuries. Researchers carefully scanning the hill identified the exact spots where the corner posts had once held up the historic structure. The meeting house basically left its footprint in the dirt for nearly 400 years. 107. Archaeologists excavated the original cannon emplacements from the Battle of New Orleans at Chalmette in 1989. Andrew Jackson had famously thrown together a wildly mixed force of militia, regular soldiers, free black volunteers, Choctaw warriors, and Jean Lafitte's pirates to defend the city against a massive British invasion in 1815. The British charged across an open field directly into American cannon fire and got obliterated in about 25 minutes. The battle technically happened after the war had already ended because the treaty news had not arrived yet. The recovered emplacements confirmed exactly where the American guns had wrecked the British advance. 108. Soldier remains from the Bloody Lane at the Battle of Antietam were recovered during National Park Service surveys in 2008. The September 1862 battle in Maryland was the single bloodiest day in American history, with roughly 23,000 casualties in 12 hours of fighting. A sunken farm road became a natural trench where Confederate soldiers held off Union attacks until being flanked and slaughtered. Bodies had piled so thick that survivors described being able to walk across the lane without touching the ground. Some remains had clearly been missed during the original burials and had been quietly waiting underneath the field. 109. Excavations conducted in 1941 finally uncovered the buried foundations of the Whitman Mission in Oregon, where a violent 1847 massacre had effectively ended American Protestant outreach to the Cayuse people. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman had established the mission to convert local tribes, but tensions exploded after a measles epidemic killed many Cayuse children while seeming to spare the white missionaries. The Cayuse blamed the missionaries and attacked the compound, killing 13 people including the Whitmans themselves. The site eventually disappeared under farmland. Archaeologists carefully relocated the original buildings, basically rediscovering one of the most violent flashpoints in early Pacific Northwest history. 110. Ground-penetrating radar in 2015 finally confirmed a mass grave from the Black Hawk War at Bad Axe, Wisconsin, where Sauk and Fox refugees were slaughtered while trying to surrender. The 1832 conflict ended with militia and regular soldiers attacking a group of mostly women, children, and elderly people attempting to cross the Mississippi River to safety. Soldiers shot people in the water and from a steamboat for hours. Estimates of the dead range from 150 to 300. Local memory of the massacre had faded for over a century until radar revealed exactly where the victims had been hastily buried. 111. Workers tearing into a 1680 Massachusetts house chimney in 1898 discovered the walled-up bones of a colonial child sealed inside the brickwork, and historians still cannot explain what happened. The remains had been deliberately placed inside the chimney structure during original construction or shortly after. No records mentioned a missing child from the household. No criminal investigation ever named a suspect. Theories range from accidental death and panicked concealment to old European folk traditions involving children being entombed as supernatural protection for new buildings. The bones were eventually reburied in a local cemetery. Massachusetts basically inherited a colonial mystery nobody can solve. And that wraps up 111 terrifying things America quietly buried and hoped nobody would ever dig back up. Spoiler alert. Somebody always digs. If your jaw hit the floor even once during this video, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. Subscribe to Dumb History and ring the notification bell so the algorithm stops hiding us from you. Drop a comment telling me which discovery creeped you out the most, and share this with the friend who thinks their neighborhood is normal. Spoiler, it is not. Stick around because Dumb History has way more buried secrets coming your way soon.